Hi everyone, please support our videos on Patreon. The link's at the end of the video and in the down there part. Thank you, you're lovely. Alright, personal challenge. Let's see if I can get through this whole video without mispronouncing a name. Encanto might just be the best animated film I have ever seen, and certainly one of the few Disney films to actually bring tears out of me. If you ask me to redo the Disney rankings, this is certainly the best film they've ever made. It's a story about trauma, dysfunctional families, and the plague on human relationships that is the refusal to communicate. Not miscommunication, the refusal to communicate. It's important I specify that. This is a film that doesn't really have a world to explore, doesn't have villains except for these unnamed characters who are literally just a plot device, and its entire story revolves around the family dynamic between the two main characters, Mirabel Madrigal and her grandmother Alma Madrigal. And let me make this clear, the two of them are the reason to watch this film. I know Twitter, Tumblr, and TikTok have been going nuts over Bruno, but these are the two main characters, and they are the best characters. Alma's arc in particular, mwah. Encanto is about the Madrigal family, a family born from displaced Colombian villagers who were given a miracle of magic that rose mountains around their new home to protect them from, I'm going to assume, soldiers from one of the 70 different organizations all vying for territory in Colombia at any given time. 57 years, holy shit. Anyway, to help keep the village safe and help it flourish in its enclosed location, children of the Madrigal family are all given magical powers to help benefit the family and the community. All of them are ultimately under immense pressure from the matriarch of the family, Alma, who was one of the survivors of the displacement and leaves the entire town and is keeping the pressure on her family to be perfect because she's afraid of losing the magical gift they were given and thus afraid of further exposure to the militants that killed her husband. All of this comes to a head when one of her grandchildren, Mirabel, isn't given a gift and becomes the black sheep of the family, sowing discord among them that threatens to, and ultimately does, destroy the magical gift they were given.
The miracle is dying because of you!
People on Tumblr were surprised that I loved Alma's arc in this film, given that I've pilloried stories about family dysfunction and abuse for putting the onus on the abused to fix everything by keeping the peace. Those takes casually ignore the fact that the film actively showcases the tactics encouraged by lesser writers as actively not working. Bruno and Mirabel misinterpret Bruno's prophecy as being about Mirabel needing to fix the damage in the Madrigal family, and so they try to do that and ultimately fail. That's the part people miss here. They try to put the burden on themselves to fix Alma's issues and fail, because of course they were going to fail. That will always fail. The change had to come from within, and it wasn't going to happen so long as Alma continued to have her precious status quo. Many of them weren't even aware that Alma was the source of the family's discord. They had inherited her trauma and coping mechanisms so completely that they didn't even fully realize something was wrong until Mirabel upset the status quo. There's a scene toward the end where Alma finally loses it on Mirabel in front of Isabella and Luisa, and it becomes the moment all three of them realize finally what the problem actually was.
I will never be good enough for you. Will I? No matter how hard I try. No matter how hard any of us tries.
I think this is the best emotional voice acting I've seen since You Have a Choice to Consider, because you can hear the realization in Mirabel's voice that everything she had assumed up until this point was wrong. She wasn't going to be the doom of Casa Madrigal, she was simply the catalyst of it. That her fate was unclear wasn't because she had to make a choice, but because Alma's treatment of her would finally become the last straw. Mirabel upset the status quo so completely that it was finally going to turn over the rug to reveal everything that had been swept underneath it. The family crowds around her as this is happening. Alma was in denial, and everyone around her allowed her to live in denial, and that denial had overtaken everything. The candle became all she cared about, and she lost sight of why her family was given that miracle in the first place. Understandably so, as she's been through an intense amount of personal trauma, but her own desires to keep her family safe by protecting the magic became an extremely unhealthy coping mechanism to the point that she actively destroyed it. And denial and unhealthy coping mechanisms are a hell of a drug. Think about how many people self-deprecate as a coping mechanism, completely ignoring the fact that self-harm is the single worst coping mechanism on the planet. A lot of people don't handle their trauma very well, and Alma is one of them. Alma's been through way too much, and a lot of them don't know that. At the start of the film, she tells the story about having to leave her home and losing her husband, and being given the magic to protect her family and the refugees that came with them. But it's very sanitized. You're only shown as much as Alma is willing to say to a tiny child, and Disney films are accustomed to having characters go through unbelievable trauma and come out just fine on the other end. Maybe they don't develop the Westermarck effect, but it's fine. It isn't until the end of the film, after everything has fallen apart and the Madrigal family has ripped itself to pieces, that the viewer is shown that, no, being run out of your home and your spouse being murdered in front of you, leaving you to raise 3 children with only a mountain range between you and violent guerrilla fighters, doesn't make for an uplifting story. In the intro, when Alma falls to her knees, it's mournful but reserved, almost stoic. You can tell that this is the version of herself she wants to present to others. But in the real memory, she's screaming with grief and anguish, and tears are streaming down her fucking face like they're about to get burned into her goddamn skin. In the intro, you're shown her waving cutely to Casa Madrigal like, "Teehee, I've been through one of the worst things that can happen to a person, but came out quirky." But at the end, you see that wasn't real. She's been through something so intensely traumatizing that even after securing safety, it never leaves her. And that results in a person who is not okay. And toward the end, you see Alma swallow her pain and put on a mask for the sake of her family, hiding what's happened to her just as she hid it at the start. The entire Madrigal family suffers from keeping everything bottled up, letting it eat away at them and slowly erode them from the inside. And Alma's no different here. Alma's hiding everything from them just as much as they're hiding their feelings from her. I see plenty of families doom themselves through a desire to keep the peace, to not talk about problems within the family and keep quiet, usually just to please the matriarch of the family, who is probably causing most of the problems. Come on guys, just keep the peace. I know she's difficult, but keep the peace. Well, we all know the problem with that by now, don't we?
I think you're confusing peace with quiet.
The house was built on a foundation of Alma's trauma, a trauma she wasn't handling and has always been at the forefront of her mind. Her solo in the Family Madrigal breaks melody and is set to the tune of Dos Oruguitas, but you won't notice that on the first viewing because, again, the movie actually keeps it a secret just how intensely and deeply traumatic it was for Alma to be run out of her home and lose her husband.
We swear to always help those around us.
Dos oruguitas paran el viento
And earn the miracle that somehow found us.
mientras se abrazan con sentimiento.
The town keeps growing, the world keeps turning.
Siguen creciendo, no saben cuándo.
But work and dedication will keep the miracle burning. And each new generation must keep the miracle burning.
Buscar algún rincón, el tiempo sigue cambiando. Inseparables son. Y el tiempo sigue cambiando.
But that's great, because on a second viewing, that realization can fucking sucker punch you right in the gut because Disney loves the taste of your tears. But the family was built on a shaky foundation. No shit, it was cracking. And disaster might have been averted if people addressed the sheer amount of stress piling up around everyone sooner. And that's a lesson they had to learn the very hard way. They tried to keep quiet and keep the peace, but it didn't work. It never works. Keeping quiet and remaining non-confrontational makes stable families unstable and dysfunctional families destructive and leading to disownment. The attitude of ignoring problems and keeping up appearances can only ever lead to a broken home, as it does in the film, both figuratively and literally. The cracks in the family are represented literally because of Casa Madrigal's deep connection to the family, and that's done for a good reason, because if you see a crack running up your wall and you ignore it, that is a catastrophically stupid decision. Hey, you know what else is catastrophically stupid? I know it sounds like I'm ragging on the film for having an idiot plot, but I'm not, and it doesn't. If you've been around since I was covering My Little Pony, first of all, I'm sorry, and second of all, you'll know that my favorite episodes of the show were the ones that hammered in the importance of confronting interpersonal discord. The best episodes were the ones that teach kids that sometimes you have to roar at a bitch. I like that their stubbornness and unwillingness to speak plainly to Alma about the stress they're under and just say everything's fine ultimately leads to this catastrophic failure. I see too many grown-ass adults flounder so hard with direct personal confrontation that films can hammer that lesson in constantly, and I would never get sick of it. It is a plague on people's mental health, and there is no excuse for it that changes that. I don't care if you're just afraid of confrontation or it's culturally ingrained into you. It is destructive, damaging, and can only lead to complete and utter failure. If you're trying to keep your family together, this is the single worst way to do that. That's like trying to put out a fire by dousing it in gasoline. If you're afraid of confrontation, get therapy. If it's part of your culture, it needs to not be part of your culture anymore. In Encanto, talking about your feelings leads to people feeling better, and changing the status quo mends the cracks in the house. Meanwhile, ignoring problems and letting Alma continue to inflict her trauma on her family uncontested only worsens them. The first part of fixing a problem is accepting that there is a problem.
And nothing could ever be broken that we can't fix together.
I guess people were surprised I responded so positively to this because I have a history of lambasting films where dysfunctional families are held together by obligation. But in those stories, the notion of keeping the peace is often reinforced, or the family members in question practically bow down before the family member causing the problems who remains completely and utterly unrepentant. This is not the case in Encanto. It's always implied through Bruno's vision and the fact that he left, that if Alma doesn't get a handle on herself, she will shatter her family apart and lose them forever. This is why the vision flits back and forth between a healed or broken home, because Mirabel can only ever be the catalyst to bring everything to the surface, and ultimately the fate is entirely up to Alma. Alma built not just her family, but the entire village around an extremely traumatic event that she has largely swallowed and internalized, and by extension unknowingly inflicted onto her children and grandchildren through her terrible coping mechanisms. Psychologists call this generational trauma, but you might recognize it by its more common name of, well, my dad had beaten my ass and I turned out fine, where the stress and unhealthy coping mechanisms are handed down through generations simply by virtue of being influenced by them. In the same way that someone can be beaten as a child and grow up thinking it was normal and do it to their children, all of Alma's children and grandchildren have inherited her tendency to bury her stress and refuse to talk about it. The reason Mirabel didn't was because she wasn't given a gift, and so she didn't have the pressure put on her that the others did, and in fact was often the target of scorn and derision and passively viewed as not a real part of the family in many ways. It's a different kind of treatment compared to anyone else, which means she doesn't really inherit the same behaviors. Again, Mirabel's very presence is a massive disruption to the status quo. She's the first indication that the miracle can be lost, and that scares a lot of people, including Alma, who knew something was up and asked Bruno to look into the future to figure out what.
You should have told me the second you saw the vision. Think of the family.
I was thinking of my daughter.
Mama, you've always been too hard on Mirabel.
Look around. We must protect our family, our Encanto. We cannot lose our home.
Paran el viento mientras se abrazan con sentimiento.
You know, Alma, it's extremely unwise to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. See what I'm getting at? Mirabel is so different from everyone that even Alma can't maintain the status quo. Alma treats Mirabel like the black sheep of the family, and so everyone else does as well. This is ultimately the conclusion that even Alma draws about Mirabel.
I asked my Pedro for help. Mirabel. He sent me you.
One could look at the gifts the Madrigal family is given as Casa Madrigal increasingly trying to mend the growing rift in the family. The house itself sees everything going on, and its own survival is predicated on the Madrigal family being happy and unified. The powers at play tend to follow along with what's most needed. Pepa and Julieta's powers certainly benefit a new village made of refugees that probably lacks certain key infrastructure and key skilled workers, so they get someone who can heal the sick and control the weather. And Bruno's powers are about seeing the future and being able to predict when catastrophes are going to happen. But that's when immediately things go off the rails, and that's when the grandkids come in. At first we have Isabella and Luisa, who again have powers designed to help the village grow and develop, but as the problems arise, the powers become more specific. Pepa can control the weather with her mood, and in the film she's always in a bad mood. That's a pretty clear inclination that when she says everything is fine, that she's lying her ass off. But denial is a hell of a drug, so her daughter Dolores can hear damn near everything that goes on, meaning that secrets become increasingly harder to actually keep in the family. But she's very choosy about what she'll gossip about. As stress piles up, Camilo's powers are about making people laugh and easing tension and stress. As mentioned above, Bruno can see the future and can predict what course the family is on if it continues to rip itself apart like this, but everyone shuns him for giving them prophecies they don't like, and he eventually flees when he sees a prophecy that Alma will absolutely not like. So by the time Mirabel is set to get her power, the house is like, alright fuckers, let's see you ignore this, and just gives her no powers whatsoever. But of course, Casa Madrigal isn't entirely cruel, hence why Mirabel seems to have a deeper connection with it than anyone else. This time, the house isn't playing around and is specifically pushing Mirabel to help. She becomes something the family wants to ignore, like Bruno's prophecies or the indoor rain that Pep is throwing around, but can't because it's too conspicuous. And then, for good measure, Antonio is given the ability to speak to animals. Like, oh, I'm just throwing an example out here, the rats that Bruno keeps hanging around with, who definitely ratted him out, fuck you, that poem was great, and that's why Antonio found them. The house continues to push and poke and prod at the negative piece, trying to force this family to mend the ever-growing rift within it, or at least acknowledge that it's there. Given that the gifts are meant to help and enrich the family, it only makes sense the house would slowly prioritize this as time went on. The house was like, talk about your feelings or I'll kill myself. This is all very good and culminates in the scene where everything comes crashing down and Alma has to talk about what really happened to her. And I think this is my favorite scene in any Disney film, in any film, period. As Alma came to the conclusion that she was the reason their family was broken, I actually cried like a fucking baby because Alma's trauma resonated with me. I'm a trauma survivor myself, but even without that, a lot of my favorite characters have been through similar horrible things, and Alma was lucky enough to get a writer who cared about that. A lot of people try to make Alma out to be the villain, but frankly that's just Tumblr tots who need a Disney villain or angsty white boy antagonist in order to enjoy something, and heaven forbid you ask them to sympathize with a Latina woman in any capacity, they'll scratch your eyes right out.
Every time.
But thankfully, the film doesn't reinforce that in any way. What Alma has been through is horrific, and it's had a very horrible effect on her, and it was completely senseless. I need to drill this home. There is no inherently deeper meaning to suffering. It doesn't inherently make you a better person. It just hurts you and makes it harder for you to trust and be kind in a world that has hurt you and that you know can hurt you again. You can track down where it started, track down the what and when and how, but sometimes the why has no answer, and searching for it will only cause you more pain. There is meaning in surviving despite it and learning to live and heal and find a purpose beyond it, but there is no fucking meaning whatsoever in suffering by itself, because all it is pain. This is something that both Mirabel and Alma struggle with the entire film. Mirabel wants to think there's a reason she wasn't given a gift and has become the black sheep of the family, but even with my own theorizing that the house did that deliberately, there really isn't a reason. It's deliberately left unexplained because it wasn't important. At the end of the day, Mirabel didn't have to go through this. None of this had to happen, and there is no grand reason for what she's been put through, no matter how many times she tries to find it. This is why Bruno's vision is so uncertain, because the future is entirely dictated by Alma's whims. And this goes double for Alma. Despite being given a miracle, that didn't make what happened to her any less senseless. It didn't give her trauma meaning, no matter how much she wants to think it did. Stories that treat trauma like a challenge set by life to overcome, or worse, pit a supposed good victim against a supposed bad victim to shame people for daring to not be okay, are some of the worst in the goddamn world. And that's something Encanto doesn't do. And I think that's why some people have such a bug up their ass about Alma, because Alma isn't dealing with her trauma very well, and the film doesn't send her to super hell for woman crimes over that, like certain other writers are prone to do. I especially love how, once Mirabel has the full story, she recognizes the absolute hell Alma's been put through and is still going through. She deserves empathy, she deserves understanding, and she deserves to be validated in the fact that what she went through was horrible and senseless. But then immediately after, Mirabel goes the extra mile to talk about all the good Alma's done, protecting her people, protecting her family, managing to build something valuable despite the hell she's going through.
And nothing could ever be broken that we can't fix together.
Their family is broken and damaged, but not irreparably so. They can learn to support each other and lean on each other, and that's actually very uplifting and optimistic of an ending, as they rebuild a home on a sturdier, healthier foundation, both literally and figuratively. Encanto is beautiful, absolutely amazing, and one of my new favorite films. It's everything I've wanted from an animated film since I started doing this job. It is fucking perfect. Some people complain that the ending is too happy, but it's a Disney film, you stuck-up little shit, grow up.